The meter clicked over to $47, and I knew something was wrong. The same route I'd taken dozens of times during the day never cost more than $18. But here I was at 2 a.m., slightly buzzed from my friend's wedding reception, watching Danny Sullivan's taxi meter spin like a slot machine. His weathered face smiled at me through the rearview mirror, the same trustworthy grin that had made him my go-to driver for the past 2 years. That night, as I fumbled for my wallet and handed over $50 without question, I had no idea I was about to uncover a systematic fraud that would rock our entire city's transportation authority. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Danny Sullivan was everything you'd want in a taxi driver. Punctual, friendly, and reliable, he'd been working the streets of Portland for over 15 years. His cab, number 347, was always spotless, smelled faintly of pine air freshener, and had working seatbelts in the back, which was more than I could say for most of the fleet. When I first moved to the Pearl District for my job as a forensic accountant at Morrison Associates, Danny became my regular driver for late-night airport runs and weekend trips when I'd had too much to drink. The first time I noticed something off was 3 weeks after Sarah's wedding. I'd been tracking my expenses more carefully since starting to save for a down payment on a condo, and I realized my taxi receipts from weekend nights were significantly higher than my weekday rides. Initially, I chalked it up to surge pricing or late-night fees I hadn't noticed before. Portland's taxi regulations were complex, and I figured Danny was just following company policy. But then came the night that changed everything. I was leaving Murphy's Pub after a particularly brutal week at work, having consumed just enough Irish whiskey to make walking home seem like a terrible idea. Danny's familiar yellow Crown Victoria pulled up within minutes of me calling his dispatch number. As we drove toward my apartment, I found myself studying the meter with the focused attention that only comes from years of analyzing financial discrepancies for a living. The base fare was correct at $2.50, but the per-mile rate seemed to be ticking faster than usual. What should have been a straightforward calculation became something more troubling as I watched the numbers climb. When we reached my building, the fare showed $34 for what I knew was a $12 ride during normal hours. Danny's explanation was smooth and practiced. Late-night zone charges, weekend premiums, and city fuel surcharges I'd never heard of before. That weekend, I began what would become a 6-month investigation that consumed my evenings and transformed my relationship with the city I thought I knew. Using the same methodical approach I applied to corporate fraud cases, I started documenting every ride, every fare, and every explanation Danny provided for the increasingly creative charges appearing on his meter. My first breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Lisa Chen, a bartender at the Rooftop who often worked until 3 a.m., mentioned during casual conversation that her regular taxi driver had been charging her almost double the usual rates lately. When she described a friendly older guy with graying hair who drove cab 347, I knew we were talking about the same person. Lisa's experience mirrored mine perfectly. Daytime rides were reasonably priced, but anything after midnight resulted in mysteriously inflated fares. I began riding with Danny more frequently, always ensuring I appeared appropriately intoxicated while actually remaining sharp enough to document everything. Each ride became a performance where I played the part of just another drunk passenger while mentally cataloging every detail of his operation. The complexity of his scheme gradually revealed itself through careful observation and strategic questioning disguised as casual conversation. Danny had perfected the art of the sympathetic overcharge. He never targeted the same passenger too frequently, rotating his victims among the dozens of regular late-night riders who used his services. His explanations for higher fares were always delivered with genuine concern for city regulations and sincere apologies for costs beyond his control. He'd even printed fake rate cards showing inflated prices for various services, keeping them strategically placed where intoxicated passengers could glimpse them but never study them closely. The technical aspects of his fraud were surprisingly sophisticated. Danny had somehow modified his meter to allow manual adjustment of the rate calculation, letting him switch between legitimate daytime pricing and inflated nighttime rates at will. During my rides, I began timing our trips with a stopwatch app on my phone, comparing the actual distance traveled with what the meter claimed. The discrepancies were consistent and damning. More disturbing was how Danny selected his targets. He kept detailed mental notes about which passengers were likely to be drinking, which routes they typically took, and how much they usually tipped. Regular customers who rode with him sober during business hours received honest service, while those same customers faced inflated charges during evening rides. It was a psychological manipulation as much as a financial one, exploiting the trust he'd built during legitimate interactions. Through careful questioning during our rides, I learned that Danny had been operating this way for at least 3 years. He'd started small, adding just a few extra dollars to fares for heavily intoxicated passengers who wouldn't notice or remember the exact amount. Over time, his confidence grew, and so did the scope of his operation. By the time I stumbled into his web, he was systematically overcharging dozens of passengers every weekend, generating thousands of dollars in illegal revenue each month. The most chilling aspect of Danny's scheme was how he'd normalized it in his own mind. During one particularly long ride when I'd pretended to be more intoxicated than usual, he'd actually complained about the rising costs of fuel and vehicle maintenance, presenting his inflated charges as necessary adjustments rather than outright theft. He'd convinced himself that drunk passengers could afford the extra charges and wouldn't miss the money anyway. My documentation process became increasingly sophisticated as I recognized the true scope of what I was dealing with. Using skills developed through years of investigating corporate financial irregularities, I created a comprehensive database tracking every aspect of Danny's operation. Each ride was logged with precise timing, GPS coordinates, actual versus charged distances, and audio recordings of his explanations for various fees. I photographed his modified meter, his fake rate cards, and even the notebook he kept in his glove compartment that contained what appeared to be passenger profiles. The breakthrough that would eventually bring down Danny's entire operation came during my 15th documented ride with him. We were driving back from a restaurant in the Alberta Arts District where I'd been celebrating a coworker's promotion. As usual, I'd carefully limited my alcohol consumption to maintain the appearance of intoxication while staying mentally sharp. The conversation turned to his work, and Danny began sharing stories about interesting passengers he'd encountered over the years. What started as casual driver chatter soon revealed the disturbing extent of his victim targeting. Danny described passengers by their drinking habits, their tipping patterns, and most importantly, their likelihood to remember or question fare amounts. He'd developed a sophisticated classification system for his regular customers, dividing them into categories based on their vulnerability to his overcharging scheme. The clinical precision with which he discussed exploiting intoxicated passengers sent chills down my spine. During that same ride, I noticed Danny receiving text messages that he claimed were from his dispatch system, but appeared to be coming from other drivers. The messages contained what looked like passenger locations and drinking status updates. My forensic accounting background immediately recognized the hallmarks of a coordinated operation rather than individual fraud. Danny wasn't working alone. He was part of a network. Over the following weeks, I began expanding my investigation beyond Danny's individual operation. Using public records requests and careful observation, I identified at least 6 other taxi drivers who appeared to be using similar overcharging techniques. They communicated through a private messaging system, sharing information about profitable locations, passenger vulnerabilities, and optimal timing for their fraudulent activities. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than I'd initially imagined. My evening rides with Danny became increasingly sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations. I learned that the network had been operating for over 4 years, systematically targeting Portland's nightlife districts and exploiting the city's reputation for heavy drinking and generous tipping. They'd identified specific bars, restaurants, and clubs where customers were most likely to be intoxicated and least likely to scrutinize taxi fares. The operation was generating an estimated $50,000 in illegal revenue annually across all participating drivers. The psychological manipulation employed by Danny and his associates was as disturbing as the financial fraud itself. They'd studied their victims' behaviors, learning to identify passengers who were celebrating special occasions, and thus more likely to be generous with money. They targeted tourists who didn't know local taxi rates, business travelers who would expense their rides anyway, and regular customers who trusted them enough not to question unusual charges. The exploitation was personal and systematic. As my evidence file grew thicker, I began reaching out to other potential victims through careful networking. Lisa from the rooftop introduced me to several other late-night workers who'd experienced suspicious fare increases. Marcus, a hotel concierge, had noticed guests complaining about unexpectedly high taxi charges. Jennifer, who worked at a popular downtown club, had received multiple reports from customers about being overcharged by friendly drivers they'd used before. Each conversation revealed new aspects of the operation's scope and sophistication. The drivers had established territories, dividing the city's most profitable nightlife areas among themselves. They maintained detailed records of which passengers to target and which to treat honestly, ensuring that their reputation among sober customers remained intact. They'd even developed code words for communicating about particularly profitable passengers or potentially suspicious situations. The technical evidence I'd gathered was damning, but I knew that exposing Danny's operation would require more than just documentation of individual rides. I needed to understand the full structure of the conspiracy, identify all participants, and gather evidence that would satisfy both law enforcement and the transportation authority. My background in forensic accounting had prepared me for exactly this type of systematic investigation. Working late into the night in my apartment, I created detailed financial models showing the scope of the fraud. By analyzing publicly available data about taxi ride frequency, average fares, and nightlife patterns, I could estimate the total amount stolen from Portland passengers over the past several years. The numbers were staggering, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal overcharges, affecting thousands of unsuspecting victims. My investigation revealed that Danny's network had been evolving their techniques constantly, staying ahead of potential detection by varying their methods and targets. They'd learned to avoid overcharging passengers who might have reason to scrutinize their bills, such as business travelers who needed detailed receipts. Instead, they focused on tourists, locals celebrating special occasions, and anyone who appeared too intoxicated to remember exact fare amounts. The most disturbing aspect of what I uncovered was how the conspiracy had corrupted relationships throughout the taxi industry. Honest drivers who suspected something was wrong were either recruited into the scheme or gradually pushed out of the most profitable routes. Dispatch operators who asked too many questions about fare discrepancies found themselves assigned to less desirable shifts. The fraud had created a culture of complicity that extended far beyond the core group of participating drivers. As my 6-month investigation neared its conclusion, I faced a critical decision about how to proceed. The evidence I'd gathered was comprehensive and damning, but exposing Danny's operation would require careful coordination with law enforcement, the transportation authority, and potentially the media. I'd learned from my corporate fraud cases that the manner of revelation was often as important as the evidence itself. The final piece of my investigation involved documenting the network's communication system and financial structure. Through a combination of technical surveillance and careful observation, I'd identified the private messaging platform they used to coordinate their activities. I'd photographed the modified meters in multiple vehicles and recorded conversations that clearly demonstrated the coordinated nature of their fraud. My apartment had become a command center for the investigation, with detailed maps showing driver territories, financial spreadsheets calculating stolen amounts, and audio recordings that would serve as evidence. The scale of what I'd uncovered was far beyond what I'd initially imagined when I first noticed Danny's inflated fares. This wasn't just individual driver fraud. It was an organized conspiracy that had been systematically exploiting Portland's nightlife community for years. The night before I planned to contact authorities, I took one final ride with Danny. As his modified meter ticked toward another inflated fare, I reflected on how his genuine smile and friendly conversation had masked such calculated exploitation. He chatted about the weather, asked about my work, and expressed concern about my safety walking alone at night. The cognitive dissonance between his apparent care for passengers and his systematic theft of their money was profound. During that last ride, Danny mentioned that he was thinking about retirement soon, maybe moving somewhere warmer where he could enjoy his savings. The casual reference to his accumulated wealth from years of fraud crystallized my resolve to see this investigation through to its conclusion. Too many people had been victimized and too much money had been stolen for this operation to continue unchallenged. As I handed Danny his final inflated payment and stepped out of his cab for the last time as an unwitting victim, I knew that our next encounter would be very different. The evidence I'd spent 6 months gathering was about to transform from a personal investigation into a public reckoning. Danny's friendly wave goodbye as he drove away would be among his last as a free man operating his fraudulent scheme. The following morning, I compiled my final report. 847 pages of documentation, financial analysis, recorded conversations, and photographic evidence that detailed every aspect of the taxi overcharging conspiracy. The scale and sophistication of what I'd uncovered exceeded anything I'd encountered in my corporate fraud investigations. What had started as curiosity about inflated fares had revealed a systematic criminal enterprise that had been operating in plain sight for years. My phone calls to the authorities would begin a chain of events that would ultimately expose not just Danny's individual crimes, but an entire network of fraudulent drivers who had been exploiting Portland's trust and hospitality. The friendly faces and helpful attitudes that had made them successful taxi operators had also made them devastatingly effective criminals. The time had come to strip away their masks and reveal the calculated exploitation hiding beneath their professional facades. Detective Maria Rodriguez answered her phone on the second ring, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd seen too many financial crimes go unpunished. When I explained that I had evidence of systematic taxi fraud involving multiple drivers and potentially hundreds of victims, there was a long pause before she asked me to come in immediately. 3 hours later, I sat in the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit, watching Rodriguez's expression change from skepticism to amazement as I laid out my 6-month investigation. The evidence spoke for itself. Audio recordings of Danny explaining fictional surcharges, photographs of modified meters, GPS data proving route manipulation, and financial analysis showing the scope of stolen money. Rodriguez called in Detective James Park from the Transportation Enforcement Division, and together they spent the next 4 hours reviewing my documentation. By evening, they'd contacted the District Attorney's Office, the Portland Transportation Authority, and the Oregon Department of Justice. What happened next moved faster than I'd anticipated. Within 48 hours, Rodriguez had assembled a joint task force including federal investigators, since the conspiracy involved interstate commerce violations. The Department of Transportation's Inspector General Office assigned Agent Sarah Mitchell to coordinate with local authorities. My amateur investigation had uncovered what they determined was one of the most sophisticated taxi fraud schemes in the Pacific Northwest. The task force's first priority was verifying my evidence through independent investigation. Undercover officers began taking rides with Danny and the other suspected drivers, using concealed recording devices and GPS tracking to document the overcharging in real time. Within a week, they'd confirmed every aspect of my findings and identified 3 additional drivers I hadn't detected. Agent Mitchell explained that the legal strategy would involve simultaneous raids and arrests to prevent the network from destroying evidence or fleeing. The Transportation Authority would conduct surprise audits of all suspected vehicles, seizing their meters and communication devices for forensic analysis. They needed my continued cooperation to maintain the appearance of normalcy until they were ready to act. For 2 more weeks, I continued taking rides with Danny, now wearing a wire provided by the task force. Each conversation was carefully orchestrated to elicit admissions about his operation while appearing like casual passenger chatter. Danny remained completely unaware that his trusted customer had become the key witness in a federal investigation that would soon destroy his criminal enterprise. The breakthrough moment came during a ride on a rainy Thursday night in March. I'd called Danny after leaving a downtown restaurant, maintaining my usual pattern of appearing slightly intoxicated. As we drove through the empty streets, he seemed more relaxed than usual, perhaps feeling secure in his years of successful fraud. The conversation turned to his retirement plans, and he began speaking with unusual candor about his financial situation. Danny mentioned that his cab driving had been surprisingly profitable over the past few years, allowing him to purchase a vacation home in Arizona and invest in his daughter's college education. When I expressed surprise at how well taxi driving paid, he winked at me through the rearview mirror and made a comment that would later become central to the prosecution's case. "You gotta be smart about it, Sarah," he said. using my first name with the familiarity of someone who'd driven me dozens of times. The city sets these rates, but they don't account for inflation, fuel costs, wear and tear on the vehicle. Sometimes you gotta adjust things to make a living wage. He paused, glancing at the meter that was ticking well above the legitimate rate. Most passengers don't notice anyway, especially the ones who've been drinking. They're just happy to get home safe. The casual admission sent chills down my spine. Danny had just explicitly acknowledged manipulating fares while being recorded by federal investigators. His tone suggested this was common practice, something any reasonable driver would do. The complete lack of guilt or concern in his voice revealed how thoroughly he'd rationalized his crimes. That same night, Danny made an even more damaging statement. As we approached my apartment building, he mentioned that several other drivers had been asking about his success and financial stability. "I've been showing some of the guys how to make the job more profitable," he said proudly. "It's all about knowing which customers to treat well and which ones won't cause problems. You build relationships with the regular folks, and they trust you enough not to question every little charge." The wire recording captured Danny essentially confessing to running a criminal training program for other taxi drivers. He'd admitted to systematically targeting vulnerable passengers while maintaining legitimate relationships with others. The prosecution would later describe this as evidence of premeditation and conspiracy, significantly increasing the potential penalties for all involved drivers. Over the following days, Agent Mitchell's team accelerated their timeline based on the quality of evidence they were gathering. The undercover operations had documented systematic fraud by 9 different drivers across Portland's taxi fleet. The financial analysis showed that the conspiracy had generated over $300,000 in illegal revenue over the past 4 years, affecting an estimated 2,000 passengers. The decision was made to execute the operation on a Friday night during one of Portland's busiest nightlife periods. The timing would maximize the number of drivers they could catch in the act while ensuring that multiple victims would be available to provide immediate testimony. Federal agents, local police, transportation inspectors, and district attorney investigators would coordinate simultaneous raids across the city. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My role in the operation required careful preparation. I would take one final ride with Danny, this time accompanied by undercover agents posing as fellow passengers. The goal was to document his fraud attempt while having law enforcement witnesses present. As soon as the inflated fare was charged, agents would reveal themselves and place Danny under arrest. The night of the operation, I felt a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that reminded me of closing arguments in high-stakes corporate fraud cases. 6 months of careful investigation and documentation were about to culminate in a single moment of reckoning. I'd spent so long pretending to be Danny's unwitting victim that the prospect of revealing the truth felt both liberating and terrifying. At exactly 11:30 p.m., I called Danny's dispatch number from outside the rooftop bar. Agents Peterson and Chen were positioned nearby, dressed as typical Friday night revelers who'd had too much to drink. When Danny's familiar yellow Crown Victoria pulled up, they approached the vehicle and asked to share the ride, claiming they were going to the same neighborhood. Danny agreed, as I'd known he would, always eager to maximize his revenue from each trip. As we drove through downtown Portland, Danny began his usual friendly conversation, while his modified meter calculated an inflated fare. Agents Peterson and Chen played their roles perfectly, acting intoxicated enough to seem like ideal targets for overcharging. Danny's confidence grew throughout the ride, and he even mentioned to the agents that late-night taxi service required special pricing due to increased insurance costs and safety risks. When we reached the first drop-off point, Danny announced that the fare would be $62 for what should have been a $25 ride. The agents fumbled with their wallets, pretending to be too drunk to notice the excessive charge. At that moment, Agent Peterson produced his badge and announced that Danny was under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and theft by deception. The color drained from Danny's face as he realized what was happening. His friendly demeanor evaporated, replaced by panic and confusion. "Sarah, what's going on?" he asked, turning to look at me with genuine bewilderment. For the first time in our 2-year relationship, I saw him without his carefully maintained mask of professional friendliness. I've been documenting your overcharging scheme for 6 months, Danny, I replied calmly. Every inflated fare, every fake explanation, every target passenger you've stolen from. The FBI has recordings, photographs, financial records, and testimony from dozens of your victims. The devastation in Danny's eyes was immediate and complete. He'd been caught not just in criminal activity, but in a fundamental betrayal of the trust his passengers had placed in him. The relationship he'd cultivated with me and hundreds of other customers had been revealed as an elaborate deception designed to facilitate theft. As Agent Peterson read Danny his rights, reports began coming in from across the city. 8 other drivers had been arrested simultaneously, their vehicles impounded and their records seized. The coordinated raids had captured the entire network in a single operation, preventing any opportunity for evidence, destruction, or flight. The Transportation Authority's audit team arrived within minutes to examine Danny's taxi. The modified meter that had been the source of his fraudulent profits was carefully documented and removed as evidence. Inspector Williams explained that the device had been illegally altered to allow manual rate adjustments, a modification that required significant technical knowledge and indicated premeditation. Danny's arrest became the lead story on every Portland news station within hours. The footage of him being led away in handcuffs, contrasted with testimonials from victims who'd trusted him for years, created a powerful narrative about the abuse of public trust. The media coverage focused on the personal betrayal aspect as much as the financial crimes, highlighting how the defendants had exploited relationships built over years of legitimate service. The public reaction was swift and intense. The Transportation Authority's phone lines were flooded with calls from passengers who suspected they'd been overcharged. Social media exploded with stories from victims sharing their experiences and expressing outrage at being deceived by drivers they'd considered friends. The scope of community impact became clear as hundreds of people realized they'd been systematically defrauded. Within the first week after the arrests, the district attorney's office had identified over 400 confirmed victims and was processing restitution claims totaling more than $500,000. The investigation had revealed that the conspiracy's impact extended far beyond what even my thorough documentation had captured. Many victims had been overcharged multiple times over several years, creating cumulative losses that significantly exceeded initial estimates. The legal proceedings moved rapidly due to the overwhelming evidence available. All 9 defendants were charged with organized criminal activity, theft, fraud, and conspiracy. The federal charges included wire fraud and interstate commerce violations, since several victims were tourists from other states. The potential sentences ranged from 5 to 20 years in federal prison, depending on each defendant's level of involvement and cooperation. Danny's case was particularly severe because investigators determined he'd been the ringleader who recruited other drivers and provided training in overcharging techniques. His apartment was searched, revealing detailed records of passenger profiles, route optimizations for maximum fraud potential, and financial documents showing his illegal profits. The evidence painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal who'd turned taxi driving into a systematic theft operation. The trial preparation revealed disturbing details about the network's operations that even my investigation hadn't uncovered. The defendants had maintained a shared database of passenger information, including drinking habits, tipping patterns, and vulnerability assessments. They divided Portland's nightlife districts into territories, ensuring each driver had exclusive access to specific fraud opportunities while minimizing competition between conspirators. Most chilling was the discovery of their victim selection criteria. The network had developed a points-based system for evaluating passengers, considering factors like intoxication level, tourist status, celebratory mood, and likelihood to remember exact fare amounts. Regular customers who might become suspicious were protected, while vulnerable passengers were systematically targeted for maximum exploitation. The psychological manipulation employed by the network was as sophisticated as their technical fraud methods. They'd studied passenger behavior patterns, learning to identify emotional states that made people more generous with money. Passengers celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, or job promotions were specifically targeted. Tourists unfamiliar with local rates were considered premium opportunities. As the prosecution's star witness, I spent countless hours preparing testimony that would explain the investigation process and document the evidence. My background in forensic accounting proved invaluable in presenting the financial aspects of the case in terms that judges and juries could understand. The systematic nature of the fraud, the coordinated efforts between drivers, and the calculated targeting of vulnerable passengers all required careful explanation. The media attention surrounding the case transformed me from a private citizen into a public figure advocating for transportation safety and consumer protection. Interview requests poured in from local news stations, national consumer advocacy programs, and transportation industry publications. My story became a cautionary tale about the importance of vigilance and documentation when dealing with potential fraud. The Portland Transportation Authority implemented immediate reforms based on revelations from the case. All taxi meters were inspected and recertified, communication between drivers was monitored more closely, and random fare audits became standard practice. The authority also established a victim compensation fund and created new procedures for reporting suspected overcharging. Danny's lawyer attempted to negotiate a plea deal, arguing that his client had been struggling financially and had made poor choices under pressure. The prosecution rejected any arrangement that didn't include full restitution to victims and substantial prison time. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, and the community impact too severe to justify leniency. The preliminary hearings revealed additional evidence that prosecutors had discovered through digital forensics. The network had maintained encrypted communication channels discussing victim targeting strategies, fare manipulation techniques, and methods for avoiding detection. The messages showed a callous attitude toward their victims, with drivers joking about drunk taxes and tourist premiums they'd successfully collected. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a training manual Danny had created for new participants in the conspiracy. The document outlined optimal overcharging strategies, victim selection criteria, and techniques for deflecting passenger suspicions. It read like a professional guide to systematic theft, complete with case studies and best practices derived from years of successful fraud. The manual included detailed profiles of Portland's nightlife establishments, ranking them by the vulnerability of their customers and the likelihood of successful overcharging. Bars near hotels were rated as excellent opportunities due to the presence of tourists. Wedding venues were highlighted as sources of generous passengers unlikely to scrutinize fares. The clinical precision of the victim targeting was deeply disturbing. As the trial date approached, the defendants' legal strategies became clear. Most would plead guilty in exchange for reduced sentences and cooperation with restitution efforts. Danny and two other ringleaders refused plea deals, choosing to fight the charges despite overwhelming evidence. Their lawyers planned to argue that the taxi industry's low wages justified their actions, and that passengers who could afford to drink at expensive establishments wouldn't be significantly harmed by inflated fares. The victim impact statements that poured in during the pretrial period revealed the broader consequences of the conspiracy beyond simple financial loss. Many passengers described feeling violated and betrayed by drivers they'd trusted for years. The personal relationships that had made the fraud possible also made its revelation particularly painful for those who'd been deceived. Lisa Chen, the bartender who'd first corroborated my suspicions about Danny, testified about how the overcharging had affected her already tight budget as a service industry worker. Her statement highlighted how the defendants had specifically targeted working-class victims who could least afford the additional financial burden. The prosecution used her testimony to counter defense arguments about affluent victims who wouldn't be harmed by modest overcharges. The business community impact was also significant. Restaurant and bar owners reported that customers had begun avoiding taxi service due to distrust, affecting their establishment's ability to ensure patron safety. The conspiracy had damaged Portland's reputation as a welcoming tourist destination and created liability concerns for businesses that recommended taxi services to their customers. Federal investigators expanded their inquiry to determine whether similar conspiracies existed in other cities. The techniques used by Danny's network were sophisticated enough to suggest they might have been adapted from or shared with criminal organizations elsewhere. The investigation's scope grew to include potential interstate coordination between taxi fraud rings. The technical aspects of the meter modifications were revealed to be more complex than initially understood. The devices hadn't simply been reprogrammed to charge higher rates. They'd been equipped with multiple rate schedules that drivers could select based on passenger vulnerability assessments. The modifications included features that would reset to legitimate rates if passengers seemed to be scrutinizing the charges closely. Danny's financial records, seized during the raid on his apartment, showed that he'd generated over $80,000 in illegal profits over the past 3 years. The money had been used to purchase real estate, fund his daughter's education, and maintain a lifestyle far beyond what legitimate taxi driving could support. The prosecution used these records to demonstrate both the scale of his crimes and his clear intent to profit from systematic fraud. The conspiracy had also corrupted honest drivers within the taxi fleet. Several legitimate operators testified that they'd been pressured to join the overcharging network or risk losing access to profitable routes and dispatch assignments. The criminal enterprise had created a culture of complicity that extended throughout Portland's transportation industry. As the trial began, the courthouse steps became a gathering place for victims seeking justice and media coverage of what had become one of Portland's most significant consumer fraud cases. The daily proceedings were packed with former passengers who'd been deceived, transportation industry representatives, and consumer advocacy groups monitoring the legal precedents being established. The prosecution's opening statement painted a clear picture of systematic betrayal. These defendants took advantage of their passengers' trust, their intoxication, and their vulnerability to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars over multiple years. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh told the jury, "They turned a public service into a criminal enterprise, exploiting the very people who depended on them for safe transportation." Danny's defense attorney attempted to portray his client as a hardworking family man who'd made mistakes under financial pressure. The argument failed to resonate with jurors, who'd heard overwhelming evidence of premeditation, sophistication, and callous victim targeting. The systematic nature of the fraud made it impossible to characterize as desperate improvisation rather than calculated criminal enterprise. The trial's first week featured testimony from transportation industry experts explaining the regulatory framework that the defendants had violated. Portland's taxi rates were set through a public process designed to ensure fair pricing while allowing drivers to earn reasonable incomes. The modifications made to the defendants' meters weren't just criminal, they undermined the entire system of transportation regulation. My testimony as the prosecution's key witness lasted 2 full days. I explained the investigation process, the evidence I'd gathered, and the techniques I'd used to document the conspiracy. The defense attorneys attempted to portray me as an overzealous amateur investigator whose conclusions couldn't be trusted, but the physical evidence and corroborating witness statements supported every aspect of my findings. The audio recordings of Danny's admissions were played for the jury, his voice clearly explaining how he manipulated fares and targeted vulnerable passengers. The technical evidence showing meter modifications was presented alongside financial analysis demonstrating the scope of illegal profits. The prosecution built an overwhelming case that left little room for reasonable doubt about the defendant's guilt. As witness after witness testified about being overcharged, a pattern emerged that highlighted the deliberate nature of the victim selection. Tourists, celebrating passengers and intoxicated customers had been systematically targeted, while sober regular customers received honest service. The conspiracy had been designed to minimize detection while maximizing illegal revenue. The trial's second week focused on the conspiracy aspects of the charges. Prosecutors presented evidence of coordination between drivers, shared victim databases, and joint training in fraud techniques. The network had operated like a criminal organization, with leadership structure, territorial agreements, and profit-sharing arrangements. Danny's role as the conspiracy's organizer became clear through testimony from other defendants who'd agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. He'd recruited drivers, provided training, supplied modified meters, and maintained the victim database. His leadership of the criminal enterprise would result in enhanced penalties under organized crime statutes. The community impact testimony was particularly powerful. Business owners described losing customers who no longer trusted taxi service. Tourism officials explained how the conspiracy had damaged Portland's reputation. Transportation advocates testified about the broader implications for public trust in regulated industries. As the prosecution rested its case, the overwhelming nature of the evidence was clear. 6 months of methodical investigation had produced documentation that left no aspect of the conspiracy unexplored. Danny's network had been exposed completely, from its technical methods to its financial impact to its psychological manipulation of victims. The defense phase of the trial was brief and largely unsuccessful. Without credible evidence to challenge the prosecution's case, the defendants' lawyers focused on mitigation arguments about financial desperation and industry conditions. The jury remained skeptical of attempts to justify systematic fraud as economic necessity. Danny chose not to testify in his own defense, a decision that likely reflected his lawyer's recognition that cross-examination would only reinforce the prosecution's portrayal of him as a calculating criminal. His silence allowed the recorded admissions and documentary evidence to stand as the final word on his guilt. The trial's conclusion brought a sense of approaching justice for the hundreds of victims who'd been systematically defrauded. 6 months of investigation and weeks of legal proceedings were about to culminate in verdicts that would determine whether Portland's transportation industry could begin rebuilding the trust that had been so thoroughly betrayed. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges against Danny Sullivan and his 8 co-conspirators. As the foreman read each verdict aloud, I watched Danny's shoulders slump with the weight of his approaching punishment. The man who had spent years manipulating passengers with his friendly smile now sat motionless, staring at his hands as the judge scheduled sentencing for the following month. The courthouse erupted with applause from the gallery packed with victims and their supporters. Lisa Chen, the bartender whose late-night rides had first confirmed my suspicions, wiped away tears of relief. Marcus from the hotel concierge desk nodded grimly, his faith in the justice system partially restored. Detective Rodriguez caught my eye from across the courtroom and offered a small smile of professional satisfaction. 6 months of meticulous investigation had culminated in complete vindication. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Jennifer Walsh addressed the assembled media with a statement that would be replayed on news broadcasts across the Pacific Northwest. Today's verdicts send a clear message that no one is above the law, regardless of how trusted they may appear to be, she declared. These defendants exploited their positions of responsibility to systematically defraud hundreds of innocent passengers. Their crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of public trust that will not be tolerated in our community. The sentencing hearing 4 weeks later drew an even larger crowd than the trial itself. Judge Margaret Chan had received over 200 victim impact statements, each detailing the personal and financial harm caused by the taxi fraud conspiracy. As she prepared to announce the sentences, the weight of community outrage and demand for justice was palpable throughout the courtroom. Danny Sullivan received the harshest punishment, 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, and restitution payments totaling $93,000 to his identified victims. Judge Chen specifically noted his role as the conspiracy's organizer and his complete lack of remorse throughout the legal proceedings. Mr. Sullivan created and maintained a criminal enterprise that systematically targeted vulnerable members of our community, she stated. His actions were calculated, sophisticated, and continued over multiple years despite numerous opportunities to choose a different path. The 8 other defendants received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with authorities. Thomas Mitchell, who had been recruited by Danny just 6 months before the arrests, received the lightest sentence after providing extensive testimony about the network's operations. Robert Hayes, Danny's primary lieutenant who had helped train new participants, was sentenced to 7 years for his leadership role in the conspiracy. The restitution phase of the sentencing proved to be nearly as complex as the original investigation. Federal probation officers had identified 847 confirmed victims of the overcharging scheme, with total damages exceeding $600,000. The defendants' assets, including Danny's Arizona vacation home and several vehicles, were liquidated to fund victim compensation. A special restitution fund administered by the court would continue collecting payments from the defendants' future earnings until all victims were fully compensated. Agent Sarah Mitchell from the Department of Transportation's Inspector General Office used the Portland case as a model for similar investigations in other cities. Within 6 months of the verdicts, federal task forces had uncovered comparable taxi fraud conspiracies in Seattle, Sacramento, and Phoenix. The techniques pioneered by Danny's network had apparently been shared with criminal operators across the western United States, creating a pattern of systematic passenger exploitation that required coordinated federal response. The Portland Transportation Authority implemented comprehensive reforms based on recommendations from the federal investigation. All taximeters in the city were replaced with new tamper-resistant units that transmitted real-time data to central monitoring systems. Random fare audits became monthly occurrences rather than annual events. Most significantly, the authority established a passenger advocacy office that provided a direct channel for reporting suspected overcharging and investigating complaints. My role in exposing the conspiracy had transformed my professional life in ways I never anticipated. Morrison Associates promoted me to senior partner, recognizing both my investigative skills and the positive publicity my work had generated for the firm. More importantly, I began receiving requests from consumer advocacy groups, law enforcement agencies, and government offices seeking assistance with similar financial fraud investigations. The Oregon Department of Justice created a new consumer protection task force and asked me to serve as its civilian advisor. The position allowed me to apply the investigative techniques I developed during the Danny Sullivan case to a broader range of fraud schemes affecting Oregon residents. Within the first year, we'd identified and prosecuted cases involving healthcare billing fraud, contractor scams, and investment scheme targeting elderly victims. Our conversation led to an invitation to guest lecture in her forensic accounting courses, sharing real-world applications of the theoretical concepts her students were learning. The teaching opportunity proved surprisingly rewarding. Students were fascinated by the practical aspects of building a criminal case, from initial suspicions through evidence gathering to successful prosecution. Many expressed interest in careers combining accounting skills with law enforcement applications. Several students began independent research projects examining potential fraud in other regulated industries. One particularly motivated student, Kevin Park, approached me after a lecture with suspicions about billing irregularities at a medical clinic where he worked part-time. His observations about duplicate charges and phantom services reminded me of my own initial curiosity about Danny's inflated fares. I agreed to mentor Kevin through a preliminary investigation that ultimately uncovered a medical billing fraud scheme affecting hundreds of patients. The success of Kevin's investigation led to the creation of a formal partnership between Portland State's Criminal Justice Department and the Oregon Consumer Protection Task Force. Students could now receive academic credit for participating in supervised fraud investigations, providing valuable training while expanding the state's capacity to identify and prosecute financial crimes. The taxi fraud case had also attracted attention from national media outlets interested in stories about ordinary citizens uncovering sophisticated criminal schemes. 60 Minutes produced a segment focusing on the investigative techniques I'd used and their potential application to other types of consumer fraud. The program's producer emphasized how systematic documentation and methodical evidence gathering had overcome the inherent challenge of prosecuting crimes involving trusted community figures. The media attention brought additional opportunities to speak at conferences and training seminars for law enforcement agencies, regulatory bodies, and consumer advocacy organizations. Each presentation allowed me to refine the lessons learned from the Danny Sullivan investigation and develop practical guidelines for similar cases. The Federal Bureau of Investigation invited me to present at their National White-Collar Crime Conference, where my case study was included in training materials for agents specializing in financial fraud investigations. The Bureau's interest reflected growing recognition that traditional investigative approaches often struggled with crimes involving systematic deception by trusted community members. Danny's network had succeeded for years, partly because their crimes occurred in plain sight, disguised as legitimate business transactions. The overcharging happened during routine taxi rides, documented on official receipts, and explained through plausible-sounding justifications. Traditional fraud investigation techniques, which often focused on hidden or secretive criminal activity, were less effective against schemes that operated through manipulation of legitimate business processes. The Portland case became a model for investigating what academics termed trust-based fraud, crimes that exploited established relationships between service providers and customers. The investigative approach I'd developed, combining systematic documentation with behavioral analysis and financial tracking, offered a framework for uncovering similar schemes in other industries. A year after the convictions, I received word that Danny Sullivan had attempted suicide in federal prison. The news came through Detective Rodriguez, who had maintained contact with the federal corrections system to monitor the case's aftermath. Danny had apparently struggled with the psychological impact of his imprisonment and the complete collapse of his reputation within the community he'd served for 15 years. The suicide attempt troubled me more than I'd expected. Despite the harm Danny had caused and the calculated nature of his crimes, I couldn't forget the years when I genuinely trusted him as my taxi driver. The friendly conversations, the reliable service during legitimate rides, and his apparent concern for passenger safety had all seemed authentic. Learning that some part of that persona might have been real made his criminal activities even more tragic. Dr. Patricia Moore, a forensic psychologist consulting with the federal prison system, explained that criminals who maintain double lives often experience severe psychological distress when their deceptions are exposed. They become trapped between their authentic selves and their criminal personas, she noted. When the facade collapses completely, they're forced to confront not only their crimes but their fundamental identity confusion. Danny's psychological crisis prompted the prison system to provide specialized counseling for white-collar criminals whose crimes involved sustained deception and manipulation of trust relationships. The program recognized that such offenders required different therapeutic approaches than traditional violent criminals or even other types of financial fraudsters. Meanwhile, the broader impact of the taxi fraud case continued to expand throughout the transportation industry. The Federal Transportation Administration incorporated lessons from the Portland investigation into new regulatory guidelines for taxi and ride-sharing services nationwide. The guidelines emphasized the importance of tamper-resistant technology, real-time monitoring, and robust complaint investigation procedures. Several other cities proactively audited their own taxi systems after learning about the sophisticated methods used by Danny's network. These audits uncovered varying degrees of fare manipulation, though none approached the systematic scale of the Portland conspiracy. The preventative effect of the publicity surrounding Danny's case likely deterred similar criminal schemes from developing elsewhere. The victim restitution process continued for over 2 years, as federal probation officers worked to identify and compensate everyone who had been overcharged. The complexity of tracking down victims whose only connection to the case was having taken overpriced T-rides required innovative investigative techniques. Credit card records, hotel receipts, and even social media posts were used to identify passengers who might have been targeted by the network. Lisa Chen, the bartender whose experiences had first corroborated my suspicions, became an informal spokesperson for other victims seeking restitution. Her familiarity with Portland's nightlife community and her natural organizing skills made her effective at reaching potential victims who might not have learned about the compensation process through official channels. The final restitution calculation showed that Danny's network had stolen over $750,000 from passengers over their 4-year operational period. The defendant's asset forfeiture and ongoing wage garnishments eventually recovered approximately 80% of the stolen money, with victims receiving proportional payments based on documented losses. The incomplete recovery highlighted one of the inherent limitations of criminal restitution programs. Defendants often lack sufficient assets to fully compensate their victims. This reality led to legislative discussions about creating victim compensation funds financed through fines imposed on related industries or regulatory violations. 3 years after the initial arrests, Kevin Park, the student I'd mentored through his medical billing fraud investigation, graduated with a degree in forensic accounting and was hired by the Oregon Department of Justice's Consumer Protection Division. His success represented a tangible legacy of the educational programs that had grown out of the taxi fraud case. Kevin's first major investigation involved a debt collection agency that was adding unauthorized fees to consumer accounts and using deceptive tactics to collect inflated amounts. The techniques he'd learned through our work together allowed him to identify the scheme's patterns and document evidence that led to successful prosecution. The case recovered over $200,000 for victims and resulted in the agency's closure. The educational impact of the Danny Sullivan case extended beyond formal academic programs. Community organizations throughout Portland began hosting workshops on recognizing and reporting consumer fraud, using the taxi overcharging conspiracy as an example of how trusted service providers could exploit their customers. These workshops were particularly popular in immigrant communities, where language barriers and unfamiliarity with American business practices created additional vulnerability to fraud. Dr. Walsh's research study, which had grown out of our initial interview, was published in the Journal of Economic Crime Management and became required reading in forensic accounting programs nationwide. The study's analysis of detection techniques and evidence-gathering methods provided a framework for training future investigators in similar cases. The Portland Transportation Authority's reforms had proven so successful that other cities began adopting similar oversight measures. The real-time meter monitoring system had virtually eliminated unauthorized fare manipulation, while the Passenger Advocacy Office had become a model for responsive customer service in regulated industries. Agent Mitchell, who had coordinated the federal investigation, was promoted to head the Department of Transportation's new Consumer Protection Enforcement Division. Her leadership of the Portland case had demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated federal-state-local cooperation in complex fraud investigations. The division's mandate included identifying and prosecuting transportation-related fraud schemes nationwide. The psychological impact of the case on Portland's transportation industry had been profound and lasting. Taxi drivers reported that passengers were more likely to scrutinize their fares and ask questions about charges, creating a culture of transparency that benefited honest operators while deterring potential fraud. The increased vigilance had become self-sustaining, creating ongoing protection against similar schemes. Danny Sullivan was released from federal prison after serving 8 years of his 12-year sentence, with credit for good behavior and completion of substance abuse counseling programs. His release conditions included continued restitution payments, supervised probation, and prohibition from working in any transportation-related industry. The terms effectively ended his career as a taxi driver and required him to rebuild his life completely. Detective Rodriguez, who had initially been skeptical of my fraud allegations, became a leading advocate for civilian involvement in financial crime investigations. She developed training programs for law enforcement agencies that emphasized the value of systematic documentation by informed citizens and the importance of taking consumer complaints seriously, even when they involved trusted community figures. The ripple effects of the taxi fraud case had transformed multiple systems and institutions, while validating the principle that ordinary citizens could effectively challenge sophisticated criminal enterprises through careful investigation and systematic evidence gathering. The case demonstrated that trust-based fraud, despite its inherent advantages of concealment and victim reluctance to report, could be defeated through persistent documentation and collaborative law enforcement response. My own career had evolved far beyond corporate forensic accounting to encompass a broader mission of consumer protection and fraud prevention. The Consumer Protection Task Force had grown into a permanent state agency with expanded authority to investigate financial crimes affecting Oregon residents. The work provided constant opportunities to apply investigative skills while making tangible differences in people's lives. The taxi fraud case had also influenced my personal perspective on trust and vigilance in daily life. I found myself more aware of potential exploitation in routine business transactions, while maintaining faith in the fundamental honesty of most service providers. The key lesson was that healthy skepticism and systematic documentation could coexist with normal social trust and community engagement. The final chapter of the Danny Sullivan saga came 5 years after his initial arrest, when the last victim restitution payment was processed through the federal court system. The completion of financial compensation marked the official end of a case that had transformed Portland's transportation industry, influenced consumer protection policies nationwide, and demonstrated the power of methodical investigation to expose even sophisticated criminal schemes. Standing in my office reviewing the final case files, I reflected on how a simple observation about inflated taxi fares had grown into a comprehensive investigation exposing systematic fraud affecting hundreds of victims. The experience had taught me that the most dangerous criminals often hide behind facades of trustworthiness and community service, making their detection dependent on the vigilance and persistence of the people they victimize. The Danny Sullivan case had become more than a successful fraud prosecution. It had become a template for empowering consumers to protect themselves and their communities from exploitation. The investigative techniques, legal strategies, and educational programs that grew out of the case continued to generate benefits years after the original conspiracy was destroyed. Most importantly, the case had demonstrated that justice was possible even against criminals who had carefully constructed personas of trustworthiness and community service. Danny's friendly smile and reliable service had masked years of systematic theft, but methodical investigation and persistent documentation had ultimately exposed the truth. The victory belonged not just to the prosecutors and investigators who had built the case, but to every victim who had found the courage to come forward, and every community member who had demanded accountability from their public institutions. The legacy of the taxi fraud case lived on in the reformed transportation systems, the educated consumers, the trained investigators, and the strengthened legal frameworks that continued to protect future victims from similar exploitation. In the end, Danny Sullivan's criminal enterprise had been completely dismantled, but the positive changes it had inspired would endure far longer than the damage it had caused. 10 years had passed since Danny Sullivan's taxi pulled away from my apartment building for the final time, and Portland's transportation landscape had been completely transformed. The digital taxi meters now displayed real-time GPS tracking, automated fare calculations, and instant receipt generation that made fraud virtually impossible. Every ride was recorded, monitored, and automatically audited by systems designed around the lessons learned from Danny's sophisticated deception. I stood at the window of my new office overlooking the Willamette River, watching the evening rush hour traffic flow beneath the Hawthorne Bridge. The Consumer Protection Institute that had grown from our small task force now occupied an entire floor of the federal building, employing 47 investigators, analysts, and support staff dedicated to preventing financial fraud across the Pacific Northwest. The morning mail had brought another letter from a victim whose case we'd just closed. Margaret Williams, an elderly woman from Salem, had been systematically overcharged by a home repair contractor who had used techniques remarkably similar to Danny's taxi fraud. The contractor had built trust through small, honest jobs before gradually escalating to major projects with inflated costs. Our investigation had recovered $38,000 for Margaret and 17 other victims while sending the contractor to federal prison for 6 years. These patterns had become depressingly familiar over the decades since the taxi case broke Portland's complacency about trust-based fraud. Criminals across various industries had adopted Danny's fundamental strategy: establish legitimacy through honest service, identify vulnerable targets, then exploit established relationships for systematic profit. The taxi fraud had been just the beginning of what we now recognized as an epidemic of trust-based financial crimes. Dr. Jennifer Walsh knocked on my office door, interrupting my reflection. She'd completed her sabbatical from Portland State University to serve as the Institute's research director, bringing academic rigor to our investigative methods. Her latest study had identified over 200 trust-based fraud schemes nationwide that followed patterns first documented in the Danny Sullivan case. The Phoenix taxi investigation just concluded, she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. 18 drivers convicted, $400,000 in restitution, and a complete overhaul of their transportation authority. They used our Portland protocols exactly, and the case moved from initial complaint to conviction in 14 months. The Phoenix success represented our institute's evolving mission beyond direct investigation towards systemic fraud prevention. We'd developed standardized protocols for identifying, investigating, and prosecuting trust-based fraud that were now used by law enforcement agencies nationwide. The techniques I'd stumbled upon while investigating Danny had become formalized methodologies taught in federal training centers. There's something else, Jennifer continued, her expression growing serious. Danny Sullivan's parole officer called this morning. He's been approved for early release next month, and he's requesting a meeting with you. The news hit me with unexpected force. Danny had served 10 years of his sentence, during which I'd deliberately avoided thinking about him as a person, rather than a symbol of the crimes we fought against. His request for a meeting created an emotional complexity I wasn't prepared to handle. What could the man who had systematically stolen from hundreds of passengers possibly want to say to the person who had exposed his crimes? Detective Rodriguez, now Captain Rodriguez heading Portland's Financial Crimes Division, had warned me this day would come. Perpetrators of trust-based fraud often experience profound identity crises during incarceration, she'd explained years earlier. They struggle to reconcile their authentic selves with their criminal behaviors. Sometimes they seek closure with the people who exposed them, looking for forgiveness or understanding they can't find elsewhere. I told Jennifer I needed time to consider Danny's request while we turned our attention to the Institute's current caseload. The morning briefing revealed active investigations involving a fraudulent investment advisor targeting retirement communities, a medical billing scheme affecting rural hospitals, and a contractor network overcharging for storm damage repairs. Each case followed the established pattern of legitimate initial service, followed by systematic exploitation of established trust. The investment advisor case particularly troubled me because it involved victims whose life savings had been stolen by someone they'd known for decades. Harold Peterson had been a respected financial planner in Eugene for 30 years before he began diverting client funds to support gambling addiction. His victims included childhood friends, church members, and former neighbors who had trusted him completely. The personal betrayal was as devastating as the financial loss. Our investigation had revealed that Harold's fraud began small, with temporary borrowing from client accounts that he initially intended to repay. When his gambling losses mounted, the temporary borrowing became permanent theft disguised through increasingly sophisticated accounting manipulations. By the time we intervened, he'd stolen over $2 million from 63 clients, many of whom faced financial ruin in their retirement years. The Harold Peterson case exemplified how trust-based fraud often began with genuine relationships that gradually became corrupted by criminal opportunity and personal desperation. Unlike traditional theft, which involved anonymous victims and clear criminal intent, trust-based fraud developed through the decay of authentic human connections. The criminals weren't sociopaths, but ordinary people who had lost their moral compass through incremental compromise and rationalization. Understanding this psychological progression had become crucial to our investigative approach. We'd learned to identify the warning signs of trust decay, service providers who became increasingly defensive about their pricing, explanations that grew more complex over time, and relationship dynamics that shifted from professional service toward personal favor. We'd developed victim interview techniques that helped people recognize manipulation they'd experienced while providing emotional support for the betrayal trauma that often accompanied trust-based fraud. Many victims struggled with self-blame, wondering how they could have been deceived by someone they'd trusted for years. The Evening News featured a story about our latest success, exposing a network of fraudulent contractors who had been systematically overcharging for roof repairs throughout rural Oregon. The scheme had targeted elderly homeowners, using high-pressure sales tactics and inflated damage assessments to generate unnecessary work orders. Our investigation had saved homeowners an estimated $800,000 in fraudulent charges, while sending 7 contractors to federal prison. The coverage included an interview with Ethel Morrison, an 83-year-old widow from Pendleton, who had nearly been victimized by the contractor network. "They seemed so professional and concerned about my safety," she explained to the reporter. "If I hadn't attended one of those fraud prevention workshops at the senior center, I might have signed their contract without question." Ethel's story highlighted the success of our community education programs, which had reached over 50,000 Oregon residents through workshops, online resources, and partnership with community organizations. We'd learned that prevention was far more effective than prosecution, both in terms of resource efficiency and victim protection. Teaching people to recognize manipulation techniques and verify service provider credentials prevented far more fraud than investigating crimes after they occurred. The community workshops had evolved into comprehensive fraud literacy programs that covered everything from identifying fake credentials to understanding psychological manipulation techniques. Participants learned to recognize the warning signs of trust decay, verify service provider licensing and insurance, obtain multiple estimates for significant work, and document all interactions with service providers. The programs were particularly popular with senior citizens, small business owners, and recent immigrants. Dr. Walsh's research had shown that communities with high fraud literacy rates experienced significantly lower levels of trust-based crime. The education programs created a network effect, where informed consumers shared knowledge with friends, family members, and neighbors. This grassroots awareness made it much harder for fraudulent operators to establish the initial trust relationships their schemes required. My phone rang with a call from Kevin Park, the former student who now directed the Consumer Protection Division's Field Investigation Unit. His team had just completed an undercover operation targeting a medical equipment fraud scheme that was overcharging insurance companies for unnecessary devices and services. The investigation had required months of careful documentation and coordination with federal healthcare fraud investigators. We recovered over $3 million in fraudulent billings, Kevin reported with satisfaction evident in his voice. 12 defendants are facing federal charges, and the insurance companies are implementing new verification procedures based on our recommendations. The techniques you taught me from the Danny Sullivan case were crucial to building the documentation we needed. Kevin's success represented the multiplicative effect of our educational mission. Every investigator we'd trained had gone on to expose additional fraud schemes, creating an expanding network of expertise that enhanced consumer protection across the region. The Portland taxi fraud case had generated investigative capabilities far beyond what any single case could justify. The week ended with our monthly all-staff meeting, where investigators presented updates on current cases and discussed emerging fraud trends. The presentations revealed how trust-based criminals were adapting their techniques to exploit new vulnerabilities created by technological change, demographic shifts, and economic pressures. Online review manipulation had become a significant concern, with fraudulent service providers creating fake positive reviews while attacking the reputations of honest competitors. The digital trust ecosystem was being systematically corrupted by criminals who understood that modern consumers relied heavily on online verification of service provider credibility. Romance fraud targeting elderly widows and widowers had evolved into sophisticated long-term manipulation schemes that could continue for years before financial exploitation began. The criminals built genuine emotional relationships with their victims before gradually introducing financial needs that seemed reasonable within the context of romantic partnership. Construction fraud had become increasingly sophisticated, with criminals using drone photography and computer modeling to create convincing but unnecessary repair estimates. They targeted homeowners after natural disasters, exploiting emergency situations and insurance settlements to generate inflated project costs. Each new fraud variant required adapted investigative techniques while following the fundamental patterns we'd first identified in Danny's taxi scheme. The criminals established trust through legitimate service or authentic emotional connection, identified victim vulnerabilities through careful observation and relationship building, then exploited established trust for systematic financial gain. Saturday morning brought the call I'd been expecting since Jennifer delivered Danny's message. His parole officer, Marcus Thompson, explained that Danny had completed extensive psychological counseling during his incarceration and was genuinely seeking closure with the people his crimes had affected. The meeting would be voluntary, supervised, and focused on his accountability process rather than seeking forgiveness or sympathy. He's not the same person who was sentenced 10 years ago, Marcus explained. The prison counseling programs helped him understand the psychological mechanisms that allowed him to rationalize systematic theft. He wants to take responsibility for the harm he caused and contribute to prevention efforts if possible. I agreed to meet Danny at the federal parole office the following Tuesday, curious about how imprisonment and counseling had changed the man whose friendly facade had masked years of calculated deception. The meeting would provide insight into the long-term psychological consequences of trust-based fraud for the perpetrators themselves. Tuesday arrived with unseasonable warmth for early November, and I found myself walking through downtown Portland toward the federal building where Danny and I would meet for the first time since his arrest. The city had changed dramatically during his incarceration, with new construction, updated transportation systems, and enhanced consumer protection infrastructure that made his type of fraud virtually impossible. The parole office waiting room was austere but comfortable, designed to facilitate difficult conversations between former criminals and the people they'd wronged. Danny sat quietly in a corner chair, looking older and thinner than I remembered, his once confident demeanor replaced by subdued humility. When he looked up and recognized me, his expression showed complex emotions that seemed to include shame, gratitude, and nervous anticipation. "Sarah," he said simply, standing but not approaching. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." Marcus Thompson facilitated the initial conversation, explaining the accountability process and the boundaries for our discussion. Danny's participation in victim impact programs during his incarceration had helped him understand the broader consequences of his crimes beyond simple financial loss. He'd written letters to many of his victims, though few had responded positively. "I need to start by taking full responsibility for what I did," Danny began, his voice carrying none of the confident friendliness I remembered. "There's no excuse for stealing from people who trusted me. I convinced myself that drunk passengers wouldn't miss the extra money, that I was just adjusting for real costs the city didn't recognize. But I knew it was theft, and I did it anyway because I wanted things I couldn't afford on my legitimate income." His acknowledgement was more direct and complete than I'd expected. The psychological counseling had apparently helped him move beyond the rationalizations that had allowed him to maintain his fraud for years. He understood that his crimes had involved not just financial theft, but fundamental violations of human trust that had affected his victims' ability to feel secure in routine transactions. "The worst part," Danny continued, "is how I used relationships I'd built through honest service to facilitate the theft. You trusted me because I'd been reliable and professional during legitimate rides. I exploited that trust systematically, targeting you and others specifically because you considered me a friend." The conversation revealed how Danny's psychological transformation during incarceration had forced him to confront the contradiction between his authentic care for passenger safety and his systematic exploitation of passenger vulnerability. He genuinely wanted to provide good service while simultaneously stealing from the people he served. This internal conflict had created the cognitive dissonance that ultimately contributed to his psychological breakdown in prison. Marcus explained that Danny's case had become a teaching example in federal prison counseling programs focused on trust-based fraud perpetrators. His psychological profile illustrated how ordinary people could gradually corrupt legitimate relationships through incremental moral compromise. The counseling approach emphasized understanding the victim impact of trust violations rather than simply addressing the criminal behavior. "I've been working with other inmates who committed similar crimes," Danny explained. "Investment fraud, contractor scams, professional service overcharging. We all followed similar patterns, starting with legitimate service, gradually expanding into gray areas, then systematic theft disguised as professional expertise. The psychology is remarkably consistent." His insight into the criminal psychology of trust-based fraud was surprisingly sophisticated and aligned with our institute's research findings. Danny's firsthand experience with the gradual corruption of professional relationships provided perspective that academic studies couldn't capture. His observations could potentially contribute to prevention programs if properly channeled. The conversation turned to Danny's post-release plans and his desire to contribute to fraud prevention efforts. His parole conditions prohibited him from working in transportation, but Marcus suggested that his insights into criminal psychology might be valuable for educational programs. Victim impact speakers were common in fraud prevention workshops, but reformed perpetrator perspectives were much rarer. "I understand if you don't want anything to do with me," Danny said directly. "But if there's a way for my experience to help prevent other people from making the choices I made, I'd like to try. I can't undo the harm I caused, but maybe I can help people understand how trusted service providers can gradually become criminals." His offer presented an ethical dilemma I hadn't anticipated. Danny's insights into trust-based fraud psychology were genuinely valuable, and his willingness to accept responsibility was more complete than we typically encountered. However, involving him in prevention programs risked appearing to reward his criminal behavior or minimize the harm he'd caused to his victims. Marcus suggested that any involvement would need to be carefully structured to emphasize accountability rather than redemption. Danny would need approval from his parole supervision, endorsement from victim advocacy groups, and clear boundaries around his participation. The focus would be on criminal psychology education, rather than personal rehabilitation narrative. Our meeting concluded with my agreement to consider how Danny's insights might contribute to our fraud prevention mission, while maintaining appropriate respect for his victims' experiences. The conversation had revealed a genuinely remorseful individual who understood the harm he'd caused, but translating that understanding into constructive contribution would require careful planning. Walking back to my office, I reflected on how the Danny Sullivan case had evolved, from personal victimization, through systematic investigation, to institutional reform, and now to perpetrator accountability. Each phase had revealed new dimensions of trust-based fraud and expanded our understanding of both prevention and prosecution strategies. The Institute had become far more than an investigative agency. We'd evolved into a comprehensive resource for understanding, preventing, and prosecuting crimes that exploited human trust. Our work had protected millions of dollars in potential fraud losses, while helping thousands of people recognize and report suspicious activity before significant harm occurred. Dr. Walsh met me at the office with exciting news about our latest research findings. Her analysis of fraud prevention program effectiveness had shown measurably reduced crime rates in communities with comprehensive fraud literacy education. The correlation was strong enough to support federal funding for expanded prevention programs nationwide. We're seeing a 23% reduction in reported trust-based fraud in communities that have implemented our full prevention curriculum, she explained excitedly. The effect is particularly strong among elderly populations and small business owners. Your taxi fraud case has generated prevention benefits far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The research validation represented the culmination of 10 years of systematic work to transform a single fraud investigation into comprehensive consumer protection infrastructure. The Danny Sullivan case had become a catalyst for social change that protected vulnerable populations across the country. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Lisa Chen, the bartender whose late-night taxi experiences had first confirmed my suspicions about Danny's overcharging. Lisa had used the restitution money from the fraud case to complete her college degree and was now working as a victim advocate for the district attorney's office. "I wanted you to know that I've been accepted to law school," Lisa announced with pride evident in her voice. "Your investigation showed me how important it is to fight for people who are being taken advantage of. I want to be able to do what you did. Take on criminals who think they're too smart to get caught." Lisa's career path represented another legacy of the taxi fraud case, inspiring others to pursue justice careers focused on protecting vulnerable populations. Several people whose lives had been touched by our investigation had gone on to careers in law enforcement, consumer protection, or victim advocacy. The case had generated human capital for fighting fraud that would benefit communities for decades. The next morning brought news that Congress had passed the National Consumer Protection Act, establishing federal funding for state-level consumer protection institutes modeled on our Portland program. The legislation included mandatory training requirements for law enforcement agencies and standardized protocols for investigating trust-based fraud. Senator Mills credited our institute's success rate and cost-effectiveness as crucial factors in securing bipartisan support. Federal funding would allow us to expand our operations significantly while providing technical assistance to new institutes being established in other states. The Portland model would be replicated nationwide, creating a comprehensive network of fraud prevention resources that could address trust-based crime at the national level. The expansion plans required careful consideration of how to maintain our investigative effectiveness while scaling up operations. We'd learned that successful trust-based fraud investigation required deep understanding of local community dynamics, relationships between service providers and customers, and cultural factors that influence trust formation. Simply replicating our techniques without understanding local contexts might not produce similar results. Dr. Walsh proposed a hub-and-spoke model, where experienced institutes like Portland would provide training and technical assistance to new programs, while maintaining focus on their regional responsibilities. The approach would preserve local expertise while sharing best practices and coordinating multi-jurisdictional investigations. Over the following months, I traveled extensively to help establish new consumer protection institutes in other states. Each location presented unique challenges and opportunities based on local crime patterns, regulatory environments, and community characteristics. The fundamental principles remained consistent, but successful implementation required adaptation to local conditions. The Denver Institute focused heavily on contractor fraud targeting homeowners in rapidly developing suburban areas. The Miami program emphasized romance fraud and investment scams targeting elderly retirees. The Seattle office concentrated on technology-related fraud involving fake technical support services and fraudulent software sales. Each specialization reflected local crime patterns while contributing to national understanding of trust-based fraud evolution. 5 years after the National Consumer Protection Act passed, our network had documented over $12 billion in prevented fraud losses and achieved conviction rates exceeding 90% in prosecuted cases. The investment in prevention and investigation infrastructure had generated economic benefits far exceeding its costs, while protecting millions of consumers from financial victimization. The personal satisfaction of this work had sustained me through the challenging transition from corporate forensic accounting to public service. Every prevented fraud scheme, every successful prosecution, and every educational program that reached vulnerable populations represented progress toward the broader goal of creating communities where trust could exist without exploitation. Danny Sullivan had completed his parole requirements and gradually became involved in our educational programs as a reformed perpetrator speaker. His presentations to law enforcement audiences and community groups provided insights into criminal psychology that enhanced our prevention efforts. The careful structure of his involvement maintained focus on victim impact, while utilizing his unique perspective on trust-based fraud development. His participation remained controversial among some victim advocacy groups, but the educational value of his presentations was undeniable. Danny's ability to explain how legitimate service providers could gradually become systematic criminals helped audiences understand warning signs and prevention strategies. His obvious remorse and complete acceptance of responsibility provided credibility that enhanced the impact of his message. The taxi fraud case that had begun with my curiosity about inflated fares had evolved into a comprehensive consumer protection movement that influenced national policy and protected millions of people from financial victimization. The investigation had demonstrated that ordinary citizens could effectively challenge sophisticated criminal enterprises through systematic documentation and collaboration with law enforcement. Most importantly, the case had proven that trust-based fraud, despite its inherent advantages of concealment and victim reluctance to report, could be defeated through community awareness, regulatory reform, and dedicated investigation. The friendly faces and helpful attitudes that made these criminals successful also made their eventual exposure more devastating to their operations. Standing in my office 15 years after that first suspicious taxi ride, I reflected on how a simple observation about inflated fares had generated a career devoted to protecting vulnerable people from exploitation. The Danny Sullivan case had shown me that justice was possible even against criminals who carefully constructed facades of trustworthiness and community service. The work continued each day with new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to apply the lessons learned from investigating Portland's taxi fraud conspiracy. Every investigation built upon the foundation established during those first months of documenting Danny's overcharging scheme, and every successful prosecution validated the principle that systematic fraud could be exposed through methodical evidence gathering and persistent investigation. The legacy of the case lived on in the reformed transportation systems, the educated consumers, the trained investigators, and the strengthened legal frameworks that continued to evolve and adapt to new criminal techniques. Danny's criminal enterprise had been completely dismantled, but the positive changes it had inspired would endure far longer than the damage it had caused. The story of how a friendly taxi driver's systematic overcharging of drunk passengers led to a federal investigation that transformed consumer protection nationwide demonstrated the power of individual citizens to create meaningful social change through careful observation, persistent investigation, and collaboration with dedicated public servants committed to justice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.